Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Network Transformation Roadmap webinar. Today's topic is an overview of Stage 2 of the Transformation Roadmap, including content being developed and opportunities for engagement. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. I'm pleased to introduce your presenters for today from the ENA and CSIRO, John Bradley, Chief Executive Officer, Energy Networks Association, Mark Patterson, Program Director, Network Transformation Roadmap, and a range of work package content experts and leaders from both organizations. This webinar is live and interactive. You're encouraged to post questions to the presenters by typing them into the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. If you are experiencing any difficulty hearing or seeing the webinar, please contact Redback Support on 1-800-733-416. If you are experiencing any difficulty hearing the webinar through your computer, feel free to dial in on 1-800-896-323 and enter the passcode 2154-325-984, followed by the hash key. Without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to John Bradley to begin.
Thanks very much. And look, thank you to everyone that's joined us online for this webinar, which is really the overview of the Stage 2 of the Electricity Network Transformation Roadmap program that's being undertaken by the Energy Networks Association in partnership with the CSIRO. We'll walk through the program in quite some detail today, and part of this is really an intention on our part to make sure that there's a fair amount of transparency about what we're trying to achieve within the work program for the Network Transformation Roadmap, but also opportunities for engagement are clearly identified up front, and we achieve that collaborative approach to the development of the inputs to the roadmap to the greatest extent possible. One of the important things I should recognise at the outset is we've got quite a few of us speaking from the program team today, so you might find a bit of clunkiness as we pass back and forward between us. We'll be trying to keep our phones on mute when we're not speaking. The other thing too I wanted to mention is that we've got the slides from this session have got a fair amount of detail in them, and we won't be speaking to every line, but we wanted to leave it with you as a resource that you can consider after the webinar also, and so they will be made available, of course, on the program website. So rest assured you don't need to get down notes in this process. I might now hand over to Mark Patterson, who'll give us an overview of what we're going to achieve today and the focus of NTR Stage 2. Over to you, Mark.
Great, thanks, John, and thanks again for joining us today on this webinar. Maybe I'll just start by really acknowledging, I think, the vision of ENA and actually partnering with CSIRO as the National Science Agency around what are some of the great challenges and opportunities for the future of electricity in this country. We'll be talking about that today. So with the having some technical difficulties here, changing slides. Okay, where we go. So our work in Stage 1 was really documented in the interim program report, which hopefully you can see on the screen there by way of the cover. And in short, that whole body of work that ran through the last 5 or 6 months of 2015 was the first part of a deliberate two-stage process. That program report published in December focused on a range of things in terms of the future of customer orientation, what would customers of the future in all their diversity value, an extensive refresh of the Future Grid Forum work of 2013 to update the assumptions and the modelling that underpin that very extensive quantitative body of work. Looking at the challenges and opportunities of integrating distributed energy resources into our electricity systems, the future business model options, the future of pricing and incentives, and directions for policy and regulatory settings around the electricity system. I guess the context in which we're doing what is a pretty ambitious project is the fact that we are operating in a country that literally the size of the continental USA, with less than a tenth of the population of that particular country, as many of you know, we have, of course, many drivers of change that put Australia very much at the front edge of electricity transformation. And for many reasons, the world is very much watching the highly distributed energy transformation that's unfolding in this country and that we're all a part of. I guess more broadly, the context of this roadmap is one where industries of all types are going through significant periods of change and transformation, particularly with digital transformation. And even in this case, the much celebrated disruptors of one year can be quickly disrupted by others, and I often think of the iTunes and Spotify example of that. And when you think about the nature of that transformation, this particular slide just gives you some of the key themes of transformation, certainly around technological decentralization that we're seeing from historically one-directional electricity system, a highly centralized system, to one that's transitioning to become much more decentralized, bidirectional flows, etc. We're also seeing that very much in the context where customer expectations, really in every industry, are changing. And in the case of electricity, what were essentially passive consumers increasingly becoming very engaged and also consumer producers as well. We're also very aware of the promise of low-cost energy storage, which obviously is front and centre for all of us in this industry and certainly in the industry press. The background of this body of work really is heavily informed by a substantial body of work that occurred in 2012, 2013, namely the Future Grid Forum process that in the order of 100 representatives from across the electricity supply chain worked over a 15-month period through a series of extensive workshops and quantitative modelling to really derive four major plausible scenarios of the long-term future for electricity in this country. And that has given us, I think as a nation, a very a much enhanced view of the plausible futures and how that might inform decisions in this multi-billion-dollar industry that we all depend on so heavily. And particularly, as this next slide highlights, that the way the future can play out is very diverse, of course, and has very significant differences in terms of the investment profiles across different parts of the system. And you'll probably be familiar with those four scenarios, namely set and forget, rise of the prosumer, leaving the grid, and renewables thrive. And it's probably one of the key insights from this particular slide is that within a somewhat similar order of magnitude of OPEX, CapEx OPEX expenditure across the system by all parties, so our system side, customer side, in the order of $1,000 billion will be invested in electricity systems and solutions by Australians between now and 2050. But some of the really interesting insights are the different scenarios obviously reveal that the actual investment profiles in different parts of the system are quite different. In the case of scenario 2, in the order of 1/3 of investments being on the customer side of the meter. So it's a very, very different world from historically where we've been. And I think that really highlights why that customers or prosumers, if you like, are actually forcing their way to the centre of the equation with regard to the future of electricity systems. And really that's a key rationale for shaping this whole program of work very much around understanding deeply what do customers in all their diversity and future customers of all types, what types of services and offerings will they value that the system needs to be able to provide. So really, in terms of the outcome of this body of work, is there on the screen in front of you. We are deliberately designing this program of work to help facilitate electricity systems in 2027 that are resilient to divergent futures. And divergent futures, plural, in the sense that we're not here saying that we know what the future is, and what we can say is that there are a number of commonalities across the major scenarios, and they provide some really valuable insights for the things that we know must be addressed, that we must deal with as what we would call no regrets options. So resilient to those divergent futures and characterised by, one, a balanced scorecard of long-term customer and societal value creation. And that's particularly characterised in terms of lower costs, fair rewards and cost recovery, more choice and control, and really enabling and securing the clean energy transition. Secondly, resilient to divergent futures in terms of whole of system efficiency, reliability and safety, and obviously these critical infrastructures and the dependence of any modern society on a secure electricity is fundamental. And then thirdly, an environment in which millions of end users are able to participate in and share the benefits of whole system optimization through vibrant markets and appropriate protections. So that's really, as we think about what is the purpose of this program of work, the roadmap in particular, that gives you a sense of the goals. The actual roadmap structure and inclusions, so that the roadmap will focus on the decade of 2017 to 2027, and it will concisely set out an integrated set of no regrets actions that span all the domains or swim lanes, the sequence and the interrelationships and milestones for the actions across the decade, and it will outline primary and secondary custodians, if you like, for each of those areas of action. So it is decidedly action-oriented. It is somewhat unique in the sense that it's taking a decadal view to transformation and really mapping out all of the systemic parts that make up what you might call the electricity ecosystem. And we'll talk about all of those parts during the course of this presentation today in some depth. So just in terms of just wrapping up this broad overview, last few things to share with you. So as we've designed this process, that does actually run, if we include both stages 1 and 2, it runs over an 18-month period. So it began in July 2015 through to December for stage 1, and then stage 2 has essentially been running from March, and it will run through to December. And the design process is really aimed at maximising collaboration. It is the program orientation is what we would call human-centred in design, so applying a number of concepts from design thinking, aiming for much greater systemic optimization, and really, as I mentioned before, a heavy orientation around a balanced scorecard of outcomes, simply because we realise that with a system that touches essentially all 23 million Australians, there are many dimensions to what all of us in all our diversity, residents, businesses, industries, actually need from this system in a balanced fashion. So it is future oriented, obviously, and probably a unique contribution that it makes is that we are seeking to transcend to some extent some of the immediate barriers that might limit our thinking about the future and really design from the future back to the present. It maximises the diversity of expert perspectives in the development of the transformation pathways, so we see enormous value. In fact, the robust character of the roadmap depends on a diversity of opinions and perspectives being considered in its construction. And all of the pathway options are objectively evaluated through detailed quantitative analysis. And our Chief Economist, CSIRO Energy, Paul Graham, is on the call today and will run you through that modelling that really wraps around the entire body of work in a very objective fashion. So I mentioned before swim lanes for the roadmap. So if you can imagine that the electricity ecosystem is not just about technology. That's absolutely, technology is a critical part of electricity systems, both system side and increasingly customer side. But it's also very much around all of the other elements that make up the system as a whole. And so you'll see here on this slide where we deal with what we call our domains and work packages, and that's really just the terminology we've used to describe the major sections of the electricity system. So the first of those domains really was some foundational work that had a heavy emphasis during stage one, where we began our customer reorientation work and the Future Grid Forum update. And then you'll see there in domains B, C, and D that refer to revenue and regulatory enablers, pricing and incentives, technological enablers. So those three are, if you like, enabling features or pillars of the system. And then domain E is what we call a next generation platform. And we'll talk about that as a capstone activity in terms of how many of these areas and innovations and changes that are happening in all of them may converge in next generation platforms. And with regard to how the roadmap will develop, these will be considered as, if you like, swim lanes in the roadmap, mapping out a series of actions and interrelationships. This diagram really just is a very brief way of highlighting the stage one and stage two activities. And while there are a number of areas that I mentioned earlier that were addressed in the interim program report in stage one, two key areas, in addition to the Future Grid Forum refresh, that we gave particular attention to, that, if you like, provide early insights into the stage two work related to what will customers of future value in all their diversity, and a number of business model options that Accenture did a body of work that was integrated into this program. It was insightful contribution to the work. And in addition to that, the work that Stuart Johnson was leading with regard to technological enablers continues. And as you see, as you look to the right of the diagram, or from the centre right, stage two has a heavy focus on the pricing and behavioural, or pricing and incentives, technological enablers, the new market operation and automation, so in terms of the next generation platforms, and the regulatory frameworks that, if you like, provide the latitude in which many of these future developments will unfold. Wrapped around all of that, as I mentioned before, is extensive quantitative modelling that Paul will take us through later in the presentation. And then just lastly here, or last couple of things, is in terms of the stage two schedule, you'll see up the top there that that quantitative modelling that really continues through the entire stage two period. So particularly focused initially on detailed modelling relative to each of the work packages that we'll walk you through shortly. And then also integrated modelling with regard to the actual roadmap construction itself later in this calendar year. You'll also see below that there is the period that we're in now is the period of developing further work package content, which deliberately builds on the work, obviously, that was developed in stage one. And so this content development period runs through the next several months. And there will be, if you like, iterative loops in which content is developed and then tested with workshops or webinars and so on, and we will run you through the engagement process later on in this webinar as well. In addition to that process of, if you like, collaborative input, feedback, and co-design, there will be formal periods of feedback on documents that are developed. And for those of you who were involved, have been involved in helping co-develop the consumer or customer engagement handbook, there have been a number of loops of workshops, webinars and discussions, and then also an extended period of formal feedback on the draft. And then, as you can see down the bottom of that slide, all of this feeds into the progressive development of the roadmap itself and the supporting reports. And if you're familiar with the previous CSIRO work with Future Grid Forum, and for that matter, the interim program report, typically that report will also be supported by a very detailed quantitative modelling report, and all of the key salient information will be represented in the roadmap for that 2017 to 2027 decade. So with that, I might hand back to Jeff just to shepherd us through any questions that people might have.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So we do have one question that's come through. It's from Rob, and I believe it's addressed to you, Mark. So the question is, based on your proposed roadmap outcome, would you agree it's valid and essential that the objective to secure a clean energy transition is somehow incorporated into the national electricity objective?
So that's a pretty hotly contested topic, obviously, and there are many views on that. It's probably not something that I can speak to on this call because it's not clearly within the scope of this work. But no doubt it would be one of the topics that was certainly both. It would be one of the topics that was certainly both discussed at some length in the Future Grid Forum process. And there may well be opportunity to talk about that through this process. John Bradley, I don't know if you've got a comment you would like to make on that.
Yeah, probably a similar view to yours, Mark, which is that I do think it's the kind of thing that can emerge in the discussions we're going to have within the regulatory work program about what the policy and regulatory measures are that are going to help achieve the broad objectives for the transformation. And the question is right to call out the fact that that is one of the key 4 dimensions through which we're judging a successful transition. But in terms of that objective of securing the clean energy transition is one of the key objectives. But whether it follows from that the right way to achieve that objective in the most effective and efficient way is to amend the national electricity objective to include achievement of carbon objectives, or whether or not you're better to address that through separate regulatory instruments and frameworks, is a matter that, as Mark says, hotly contested, and from a program point of view, we don't have a prejudged view on it yet. It's the kind of thing that we think the program can bring out discussion on as we go forward. But back to you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, John and Mark. We'll just wait a few moments to see if any more questions come through. If you'd like to type a question to Mark or John, please type it in the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. We'll just wait a few moments to see if any come through. Okay, it looks like there are no questions coming through. So if we can, I'd like to progress us to Stage 2, detailed overview of Stage 2 work packages. Oh, we do have one question coming through, my apologies. So the question is from Mark, and I'll just push this. So the question comes from Mark. The question is, how do you, with no regrets, options the situation where consumers continue to bear the risk? seems to be a problem with the question. How do you, with no regrets options, the situation where consumers continue to bear the stranded asset risk of future bad decisions? And that question is directed to John Bradley.
Yeah, thanks very much for getting the really easy questions out of the way up front. I think that's been useful. Now, look, this issue around the future allocation of risk between investors, if you like, and customers, and in the risk framework that's implicit within the regulatory framework at the moment is a central issue which needs to be recognised as an aspect for debate and policy debate within the work program. Garth Crawford will be going through the regulatory work program in just a moment, and he will call out that issue around the risk allocation in the new models as something that's going to be a central part of that work program. And so what the general answer to the question, though, would be in terms of how you avoid or how you create no regret options for setting the right policy framework is something that we want to explore in that work package, so that we've got a recognition of what the advantages and disadvantages are of different models of risk allocation, and what the benefit for customers would be in terms of considering alternative frameworks. So there is an analytical approach intended to address just that question. We might pick that up again as we go forward in the webinar.
Okay, thanks, John. Just wait a few more moments to see if any further questions come through, but it doesn't look like anyone is typing any more. We do have one more. We have it's more of a comment again from Mark. So the comment is, consumers are well aware of the disadvantages of the current risk allocation. John Bradley, did you have a response for that?
In the spirit of Tony Jones from Q&A, I'll take that as a comment, and I think it's a reasonable perspective. We understand the point that's being made. We're happy to move forward.
Okay, thank you, John. If anyone has any further questions, please type them down to the chat box.
I should just say, Jeff, just while you're waiting there, that from a program design point of view, and certainly CSIRO has a strong interest with the ENA to have the spaces throughout this process where we do have open, transparent discussion and debate where we need to on these things. I'll speak to later in the webinar our engagement principles. Obviously, as a program of work, it has a finite duration, and so we need to manage our effort to create the space for, to debate the thorny issues. But I'll run you through how we deal with that as well, because certainly we have plenty of appetite just to work through any of those issues in a structured way. So are you happy for us to move on, Jeff?
Hi everyone. So it appears we have no further questions coming through at this stage. So if we proceed to detailed overview of Stage 2 work packages, Mark Patterson will be your first speaker. If at any stage you have any questions during this time, please type them into the chat box and address them to the speaker you would like to ask the question to. Without further ado, I'll pass you over to Mark Patterson.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And I will be handing over to my colleagues shortly. But just as we work through each of the work packages, excuse me, you'll see this legend. Essentially, we're just seeking to take you through a high-level view of the scope that we're going after with the particular work package, a general approach to that scope, and then also some information around the engagement process, which is a key part of the reason for this call, to really give you a clear view of the whole program and clear view of how you can engage in that. So the first work package that we're dealing with now is what we refer to as work package 2 and 3, which is really about, we've brought together 2 work packages from stage 1, and that was part of our rationalisation process to really just making sure we focus closely on the key things that we need to address as a system. And this is focused on the customer reorientation of services. Because this work, a significant body of this work was undertaken in stage one, I'll highlight both some elements of what was done in stage one, but also what we're now focusing on in stage two. But just at a high level, as we think about the objective of this particular body of work, it's a clear recognition, really in the DNA of the program, that customer orientation must be central to thinking about the future of electricity. And the reason why that's true is because whether any of us like it or not, customers are forcing their way to the centre of all relationships enabled by digitisation, and certainly that's the case in energy. And so that really means that any industry that wants to thrive needs to be clearly seeking to create value on the customer's terms. So this work has been collaboratively exploring what the future of customer segmentation might look like, and that there's a significant body of work in the interim program report that is available on the ENA website under the roadmap link. So extensive amount of work around the future of segmentation, the diversity of services that future customers may value, and also thinking about how business models and industry partnerships might evolve to deliver this value. And we're seeing that in many industries where the nature of supply chains and value chains and really what is increasingly thought of as value networks is changing the face of the way services are created for customers. So I'll run you through really quickly just some of the elements, and many of you will be familiar with some of this work, but as I've mentioned, one of the major deliverables has been focusing around customer value products and services, and thinking of that through with the help of many stakeholders, many of you on the call, of really thinking about the ways customers are already and increasingly in future will characterise what they value rather than what someone else values on their behalf. And really supporting that is thinking hard about how business models themselves are likely to evolve, and the way that impacts the nature of creating those services, the nature of delivering those services to customers, the nature of servicing the desire of customers, some customers, to actually be producers themselves, and increasingly producers not only of generation services back into the system, but also potentially ancillary services and so on that are monetized and that customers have a quid pro quo share of. I've mentioned there that, in that second dot point, that historically this has been a linear supply chain, and how that is evolving, as with many other industries, into perhaps more of a value network architecture, and really looking at how business models actually enable commercially the mass integration of distributed energy resources, and particularly from a point of whole of system value creation. So the value that can be shared with customers obviously increases the more that, as a society, distributed energy resources can actually serve the whole as well as the individual. Thirdly, we've been looking at in some detail with regard to how transmission services, in terms of long distance transmission services, what roles they have in actually helping co-create those new services as well. And that interestingly has been an area that has not received a significant amount of attention, even in the global literature. So, as with many areas of this particular program of work, we're having to break some new ground internationally as well. And fourthly, an area that, as I mentioned earlier in the call, that is more of a near-term activity, but really a foundational activity, is we have been developing, with the assistance of many customer representatives, a customer engagement handbook that really articulates some evidence-based principles around how, as an industry, customers can be effectively engaged, how their views can be made genuinely manifest in decision-making of the industry. And that's actually been underpinned by the CSIRO's social research team, so really to bring some expertise from the team and behavioural economics insights into that work. So in terms of this important piece of work, and particularly some of the further work that we are doing in stage 2 with regard to articulating and comprehending or anticipating the value that future customers will be seeking and are seeking already in many cases, we will be running a workshop in mid to late June, and it's likely to be the week commencing the 13th of June. That will be a half-day session back-to-back with a half-day session that Garth will speak to shortly around future regulatory options and pathways, which relates to Work Package 6. We'll also have a number of subsequent webinars we expect, which are scheduled through July and August on an as-needs basis to engage with this particular content area. And as with all of these work packages, some of you on the call might have a particular interest in particular areas, and so we would welcome your participation in as many or as few of these work package activities. You have my email address there in terms of this particular work package, and there is a PDF that's being circulated with contact details. We would welcome registrations of interest from any of you with regard to any of these work packages that we are presenting to you today. So perhaps at that point, if I hand over to Garth Crawford, who will take us through the regulatory frameworks and mechanisms. Thanks, Garth.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and welcome. Look, what I wanted to do today was just begin with a very brief recap of where we got up to with stage 1 of the interim report, just to frame up what we're proposing to do in this stage 2. So in stage 1, effectively we did a bit of a scan around the future regulatory models debate and environment, and also picking up the questioner's indications around risk allocation. We also looked at the transformation of existing risk allocations and did a bit of a taxonomy of risk analysis in that, and indicated that stage 2 would further investigate this issue. But one of the core outputs of stage 1 of the work package on regulation was some proposed design principles for the regulatory framework. We developed up 7 individual principles which we would seek to test the regulatory framework against. And so effectively this stage 2 would seek to do that in large part. So in terms of the objectives of the regulatory framework which we consider we should seek, we've put that up there as the consumer interests being protected by vigorous competition between active commercial players, with the opportunity to deliver enhanced customer and commercial value through building and seeking economies of scope and scale. So we're really sort of starting to think from the consumer point of view, what is the objective of the regulatory framework? And also a secondary objective, a lighter-handed framework of economic regulation to be applied to a reduced set of services, potentially recognising competition, enabling greater flexibility and innovation while delivering outcomes that, out of alignment between consumer and network interests, serve the long-term interests of consumers. And thirdly, where common assets, the sort of backbone of the network, underpin the delivery of these services, and for example, universal service obligations with energy as an essential service, that these are efficiently funded through well-understood, stable regulatory compacts. So that's the kind of objective we set ourselves for the sort of targets, as it were. Key themes of the work, and I've done a little bit of aggregation here, so there is a lot underpinning each one of these, which I'll be happy to speak to individuals around. But the first is that how can economic regulatory frameworks appropriately recognise new and emerging competition? just recognising that the network service is part of what is being disrupted potentially in this new environment, and how can regulatory frameworks adapt to that, potentially change their scope in response to that. And then looking within the regulatory framework around the boundaries of competition and regulation, what is the scope of the regulated service itself and the impacts of changing consumer demands, new technologies and markets. And so that will obviously take up issues which are both here and now issues in the sense with ring fencing debates, but also look further in a strategic way about where would you like to reach between that in a strategic way in that boundary setting between regulation and competition. Third is the one John referred to earlier around the allocation of risk between network and customers in the future regulatory compact for long-term common infrastructure, including the consequences of changing risk allocations. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we did in stage one was do that taxonomy of current risk allocations. And one of the things which we'll be doing through this stage two is really thinking and taking input from a range of stakeholders around, well, once you start changing that allocation of risk, what are the consequences of those? And we certainly don't have any sort of preset views about what the right answer is on those scores. And fourthly, we'll be looking to examine the emergent different energy regulatory models in the UK, New York, California, emergent different energy regulatory models in the UK, New York, California. There's a whole range of international practice being shaped at the moment around how these forces of disruption and new energy market services can be adapted and can be best utilised, and how the regulatory framework can enable that in the best way. So our point here is that although we may be on the leading edge of some of this debate in some respects, there will be others who have done more thinking in other areas, and we should learn from that where we can. So just as an example of the sort of issues which we might get into under that fourth point, the concept of regulatory settlements and constructive engagement, for example, is a different way of going around economic regulation. New versions of CPI minus X, considerations of TOTEX approaches in the UK, for example, and a greater role of external benchmarking in access pricing setting. Those are the sort of issues which are embedded under that fourth point. In terms of the outputs of the program in the work package 4, what we see is first a major piece of work being a future regulation working paper in July, which will be an expert report on that sort of menu of potential alternative regulatory models, which I'll walk through, identifying their pros and cons and really identifying how they best meet those principles which we've set in stage one, and how we might structure the transition to some of these new models going forward. Like, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? A second output which we want to develop is an investor perspectives workshop, and our point here is really trying to build a conversation between policymakers, consumers, regulators and industry around the implications of some of those design choices, and particularly the implications of those risk allocations that we have considered, and how open that conversation so that we're making policy on the basis of all perspectives being understood and developed. The third element really falls a little bit from the first future regulation working paper, but we've decided to do a desktop study on network innovation, incentive schemes and policies. And this is an area, for those of you familiar with the sort of economic regulatory debates, this is an area which has bedeviled policymakers and regulators for some time. How do you inject the right incentives for network innovation? What are the sort of structures that best enable that? What are the incentive schemes that best enable that? And so what we envisage here is a survey of international practice, potentially drawing some recommendations for Australian practice as well. And finally, in terms of engagement, we see two major opportunities for input from stakeholders. The first is we would undertake a consultation and participation in a workshop that Mark mentioned around a draft of that future regulation working paper in mid to late June, and also a consultation on the draft regulation network innovation desktop study as well. And as Mark said, please, if you're interested in this work package, please feel free to contact me. On my email is there on the screen. And over to you, John.
Well, thanks very much, Garth. And I'll now turn, as I'm getting ready to take us to the next slide, I'll now turn to an overview of Work Package 5, which is dealing with pricing and behavioural enablers. And it's a fairly broad scope here, but will deal with a number of issues that are pretty intrinsic not only to the incentives for investment decisions, both in conventional and network infrastructure, but also in new distributed energy resources, but also intrinsic to potential new market platforms that we'll talk about in one of the later work packages as we might see the emergence of models for transactive energy systems. So maybe, again, to come to the objectives of what we're trying to achieve in this work package of the program, there are a number of components to it, but the first one sits around a series of themes about understanding how network pricing and incentives can evolve to enable service innovation. And that's the right incentives for service innovation, not only through the energy networks system, the electricity networks that we're focused on as part of this roadmap, but also the service innovation that will come from those outside of the grid, providing new services as intermediaries or retailers or other customer-driven applications. And as Mark was alluding to earlier, the way in which we structure, if you like, grid pricing frameworks and incentives will be pretty critical to creating the platform by which other players will come and create value on that grid and create value exchanges between not only the existing market participants, but whole new ranges of services, with customers potentially providing services back into the system in return for financial benefit rather than just receiving services from the system. So that lays the basis for that exchange platform. And what this piece of work will be trying to do will be looking at how we get from where we are today to an evolution which allows those new signals to be sent, those new incentives to be sent. The second aspect of the work is to focus on the enablers of the transformation, and I think we all recognise that at the moment Australia has metering stock which sees about 70% of meters being read as accumulation meters that won't record the time of energy use as opposed to the volume of energy use over the metered period. So what's going to be the future of our take-up of more advanced meters? How does that work in the context of other changes within the energy system? The second area of enablers that are a key kind of input to this area, what will be the clear choices and preferences of customers, and we'll look there to draw on the behavioural economics work and the capacity of CSIRO in some structured pieces of work there, and also relatedly looking at the enablers of social licence. One of the key issues which we all recognise is facing tariff reform in the short term, but also the emergence of new product prices and incentives, is consumer trust in the existing and new service providers, but also the broader social licence for these kind of changes. The third component in terms of an objective is to make sure that the options that we're identifying are promoting some of those key principles which have been accepted by a broad set of stakeholders as being important in pricing design and implementation, including that it not only promotes efficiency, but it also promotes equity in terms of the treatment of customers, but also the non-discriminatory treatment of technologies and choices, that it promotes simplicity, price stability and avoiding adverse price changes to customers and minimising adverse price changes to customers over time, that it promotes the viability of the system and the participants in the energy system as a whole, and that it promotes the minimisation of cross-subsidies, which is a pricing objective that we've picked up as part of our recent tariff reform handbook released for consultation, that we think Rocky Mountain Institute in the US was right to call out as a new dimension given the pace of change in distributed energy resources. The last objective that we're looking to achieve here is obviously to provide then the inputs to those roadmap measures. What are the specific actions that need to be taken by not only networks but other parties in order to achieve that evolution I was speaking about earlier and achieve those no-regret objectives. I'll turn now to the key areas of analysis. So what work are we going to do that should actually help us to try and address some of those objectives? The first thing to recognise in relation to this analysis is that it's going to be pretty intrinsically integrated with the whole of system modelling, which Paul Graham will talk us through in a moment. And we're really pleased that we've got not only CSIRO's expertise involved in energy system modelling in this process, but also Energea involved as partners with the CSIRO, and a combined modelling effort there, which will allow us to probably not only do quite rigorous analysis of some of these specific issues that will inform our thinking on pricing and incentives, but also then to bring that back into the whole of system assessments that CSIRO would do that would help us to make conclusions about roadmap actions and options. So in terms of what this means in terms of the areas of analysis, the first chunk of work, if you like, relates to how we address that path of evolution, the medium to longer term priorities in network pricing incentive reform. And as part of that work, we'll be looking to value those, what we described as second wave reforms in our interim report released in December. Those second wave incentives we're thinking of as being reforms that might be a tariff change, but might also be new market opportunities that will follow on from what we're seeing at the moment as the focus on generally a move towards more demand-based pricing in network tariffs. With second wave incentives, we're looking at a range of pricing and incentive solutions that might be more focused on locationally specific outcomes in the network and outcomes that are more dynamic in time. And while it might include things like critical peak pricing or peak time rebates offered by the network, it would also be within the scope of that to see generation network credits, embedded generation network credits being one of the tools to try and target that, or intermediaries coming in and providing direct services to utilities by aggregating demand response, say, or demand management. So there's quite a range of things within that suite of measures that we'd be looking to establish insights on the potential value for that and for the system as a whole and individual participants and customers. And the key thing there would be to sort of think about that in terms of, in a roadmap sense, in terms of how you would best manage the sequencing of reform and changes in a way that benefits customers. The second set of issues that would be the focus of the analysis is in relation to a quite deep analysis around the potential emergence of microgrids and standalone power systems. So at an individual customer level, scope to snip the wires, if you like, and leave the grid, or move into different models of delivery, which might be a microgrid with a skinnier connection to the large grid or no connection whatsoever. So we're very interested in this piece of work to look at what are the plausible penetration scenarios for those kinds of services and build on analytical work that's been done for others recently, but also to look at what are the service relationships between the network service providers in the conventional grid and those microgrids or standalone power systems. Indeed, will we see alternative models where the network service provider is deploying microgrids, as we're starting to see, as an alternative to the conventional service. But where they're not, what are the kind of microgrid pricing products which would need to be in place to facilitate? What we're describing there is the efficient and timely substitution for both individual customers and embedded networks. So where it's more efficient as a delivery model, how do we make sure that our system can support these new delivery models emerging? There's a range of issues that fall out of that also for the regulatory framework in relation to customer protection and informing customer decisions and support for customers in that process. And in that area, just as an aside, we're very interested in building on some of the other work that's being done through a program called Power Transformed, being led by the Consumer Action Law Centre, which is looking at a range of issues to do with customer protection and the rights of customers in this new future. I might turn to the third issue, which is in relation to the potential for transmission pricing and incentive reform. Here we're recognising that a lot of the focus in our work to date has been around distribution pricing, but there are also potential options to achieve better alignment with transmission pricing. And we'd like to explore what the net benefits of those to customers would be and implementation barriers. And then the last two pieces of work relate to the enablers, if you like, of these incentive reforms. So in relation to social licence and behavioural change, we'd like to use CSIRO to assist us with an analysis or synopsis of what are those potential changes that can build social licence in a credible way in relation to incentive changes over that period from 2017 to 2027. That's the critical decade we'd be focusing on for implementation. And then also to look at the potential for a quite structured research program in relation to field research or trials, which would help us to quantify adoption rates and provide strong inputs into our roadmap. The last issue relates to, if you like, the transition between the first wave measures in relation to demand-based tariffs and these broader set of incentives. And so we'll be making sure that we can not only draw on the work in the Electricity Network Tariff Reform Handbook there to enable the current first wave reforms to be bedded down, but also look at, from a quantitative point of view, what the differential outcomes might be in relation to energy volumes, customer bills, cross-subsidies, economic costs, or carbon abatement, the key outputs through which we'll be looking at a lot of the outcomes of the roadmap. So I'll turn then to how we'd like to engage in relation to this work package. And in some parts, it will have a dedicated level of engagement as per the first dot point there, which highlights that we'll be looking at either a webinar or a workshop around late July, early August in relation to those key parts of this work package. But in other areas, we'll also be looking to bring out the insights and analysis as part of broader program-wide workshops that you'll see in our slides that are to come up soon. There'll be a series of documents which we expect to release for stakeholder feedback commencing in late July, early August. And the three of them are listed there, which is the medium to longer term priorities for network pricing and incentive reform, our analysis on role and incentives of microgrids and standalone power systems, and then that piece of work around the enablers relating to social licence and behavioural change, but also meter migration. So for those of you interested in registering your interest, please find my contact details there at the bottom of this work package. We are at the moment filling a position within the ENA, and we have Don Woodrow really helpfully helping us with this work package at the moment, and so between us we'll make sure that we can bring you into the process as helpfully as possible. And with that, I think I'm right to hand it over to Stuart now.
Thanks, John. The next part of work we're going to be talking about is Work Package 6, which is basically looking at this work package is looking at the technical issues that need to be considered in the roadmap. As you're all aware, networks were originally designed to deliver that traditional one-way flow of energy. But what we want to look at as part of this is the distinct measures we need to undertake to transform the current networks into an enabling platform to allow for the ease of connection, two-way flow and demand-side services for customers, whilst improving network performance. The idea is to develop these actions and measures with a common vision in mind of the preferred end state and the pathways we need to identify for the evolution of the physical grid over the next 10 years. And so trying to work with all the different stakeholders out there to try and find out what that common vision is and where we need to be. I suppose that's represented by the diagram on the side there, where we can see how we've moved from that traditional network model to the present with the rise of renewable energy sources to where we need to get to allow for that grid-side services and technologies, energy productivity, distributed resources and smart grid
and connected and disconnected microgrids, and developing all of those with the customer in mind in terms of how we actually deliver those services. So this piece of work we're doing in this area will actually build on the results of stage one, which identified the barriers and technical issues with the current system, and also identified some of those potential solutions. And so we've actually then used those to actually frame up what we're trying to achieve as part of. So we've actually then used those to actually frame up what we're trying to achieve as part of stage two in terms of how we're actually going to solve some of those issues. Now these are all going to be developed as distinct pieces of work which will actually come out as working papers. Now the first one we're looking at is looking at around grid design and operation. The whole idea here is to actually develop what is the functional description or specification of the DSO functionality that we are likely to be require for the inherent future network services. The whole idea is to identify what is the optimum design and operating parameters of an inverter-dominated power system of the future to allow the likely reduction in the level of synchronous generation and the increase in non-synchronous generation in the system. So how are we actually going to move to a more inverter-based system to actually enable that equivalent conventional inertia. What we need to look at identifying the solutions to efficiently design and control and operate the grid-connected, islanded and non-connected microgrids and mini-grids, and establish the same actions required for their implementation. So we're looking at obviously the whole network as a whole, but then if we're going to end up with more microgrids or mini-grids on the system, we need to actually make sure that we look at what is the optimal design for those as well, and actually and what are the steps to actually to getting to that optimum design. And then also, finally, is establishing the optimal requirements to address the balancing challenge by undertaking further analysis to develop potential solutions. These solutions may include the provision of greater flexibility from existing and new sources of generation and demand, and this could be achieved if resources had the capabilities to start and stop multiple times per day and start up with short notice from zero or low electricity operating levels. So the whole idea is to try and identify those issues and actually build it to take those into account and actually come up with what are the steps we need to do to actually redesign the system to enable for that. The next piece of work is around identifying the operating platform that allows that optimization and coordination of those diverse range of new products and services. This is specifically around, piece of work is around looking at the network operation and control that will be required to alleviate some of those technical impacts and maximize the benefits of that new demand-side technologies. Specifically to assist in things like storage coming on, microgrids, electric vehicles, and other embedded generation. Establish credible strategies and a plan to develop approaches to network operation and control. Establish those optimal controls required to maximize system performance and maintain system stability and global optimization by identifying the required hierarchy of control layers that will be needed that will enable the required information exchange. Provide the detailed technical issues that need to be included around how energy storage can be optimized to mitigate some of those system operability issues, such as frequency and voltage stability, replacing inertia or helping with that, constraint management issues on the network, and the steps required. And not just doing that at the grid scale, but also doing that at community scale and also at household scale as well, recognising there's going to be a range of different levels of storage within the networks going forward. Also identifying the technical challenges to enable grid-connected and islanded non-connected microgrids and mini-grids and establish the actions required for their implementation. And finally, this piece of work will actually be establishing a framework to facilitate demand-side response and to identify the requirements for purpose-sufficient monitoring. From that, the next pieces of work is around the technical enablers. And this is actually, again, building on what we've done in stage one, where we identified a whole lot of gaps in standards. And there's also some other pieces of work that we've worked on with, like the work that CEC did, to identify, we've identified a whole lot of different gaps in the current suites of standards that are out there. And the whole idea of this, the first part of this piece of work is actually working with Standards Australia and other bodies out there to establish a strategy which has prioritised actions to deal with the gaps in industry standards and guidelines, to actually work out what we need to do in the short term, medium term, and long term to actually get to the platform we need to be in 10 years' time. But instead of being reactive in terms of where we've been at the moment with standards, we're trying to catch up, is trying to actually look forward and actually be proactive in this area, so the standards can actually be built along with how technology is coming along. The second component to this is actually establishing what are the communication requirements needed to enable the full range of intended smart grid activities. In this section, what we're looking at doing is actually identifying what is the minimum functionality requirements for those smart technologies and energy systems and demand-side technologies such as storage, microgrids, electric vehicles, etc., and to include two-way communications and last-gasp capability consistent with the best interests of the customer. Identify what are some of the immediate communication needs associated with smart meters, including long-term communication needs associated with other smart grid applications, making communications scalable so that they can accommodate additional smart grid functionality as that develops over the next 5 to 10 years. The issue around cybersecurity, because there are going to be issues in this, particularly with that two-way communication there. So how do we actually make sure that that's in there, so we've got that security for the system, and open standards and interoperability principles to maximise some of those future technology options.
Hi, Stuart, sorry just to interrupt. Would you be able to move the speaker or mouthpiece just a bit further away from your mouth? We're just getting a bit of feedback, that's all.
No problems. Is that better?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you.
The next one goes back onto the first three bits of working packages. It's actually going through and identifying the key gaps in research and development that are required to enable some of that operating platform to deliver that integrated grid of the future. So the whole idea is actually, once we go through that, is identifying where we do have those gaps and actually, again, turning that into a prioritised plan where we can work with different stakeholders across the industry to actually fill those gaps, and we can actually look at doing that in a way that's coordinated for the whole of the industry to actually help us fill those gaps and actually move forward. And last but not least, the last piece of work that we're looking at in this work package is around the future industry workforce requirements. So again, establishing a strategy to identify and facilitate the changes required to service the future skills and training requirements for the electricity supply industry out to 2027 and beyond. We identified that things are moving so quickly that some of our skills and technologies of our existing workforce will need to be actually brought up to speed in this area, and so identifying where are the critical steps that we actually need to be proactive in terms of developing those new training packages and university courses for our engineers of the future to actually enable this. And it's not just for our for network providers, because there's going to be more and more interaction with the grid. So how do we actually design those training packages for the workforce that are actually going to be having the interactivity across the board on this area, so we can actually, it's in a holistic way, look at how the workforce can evolve going forward. I just threw this diagram in at the end. It's not exactly how it would be designed, like that, but the whole idea of this is to show that we need to actually take all these things into account in terms of actually building that highly integrated network and power flow structure for the future. And so these are all the things we need to put together, and hopefully from this piece of work we can actually come up with a vision on how this should actually be structured and designed, and how we actually, and what the steps are to actually then move towards getting there. So I suppose this is just a visual representation to actually show how all the different components of that network In terms of engagement for this, most of the technical papers are going to be done, we're going to be working with people around through June through to August, and the whole idea is engaging with external stakeholders throughout that period in the development of those working papers. Specifically, we'll have some workshops in June, particularly around the future workforce requirements and also around the grid design and operating platform. If people are particularly interested in some of the work that we're going to be doing as part of this work package, feel free to contact me at DNA, and contact details are there. And pass on to Mark, I think, is again next.
That's it. Thanks, Stuart, and thanks for that overview. So, look, just in the interest of time, I'll move through this next section reasonably quickly, but it is with reference to the next generation platforms, what we call Work Package 9. And I guess this body of work really is a capstone activity for many of the other bodies of work that we've been speaking about. And in that sense, bringing together many different bodies of insight that are developing and being developed through work packages 1 through 8. And particularly thinking about the types of market operation and automation needed in a highly distributed electricity future. And I think this is where some of the futures work that we've done with industry is really helpful, because the plausible scenarios developed out of the Future Grid Forum process and then refreshed in 2015 really would suggest that it's plausible that in 2050, 30 to 50% of Australia's generation volume in megawatt hours will be delivered into the system from distributed sources. So clearly that has monumental impacts technologically, economically, in terms of the way that is valued and monetized. And so really this body of work is bringing together insights around how we would converge many of the elements, ingredients that we've been talking about, really to achieve the ends of a system that's able to instantaneously balance dynamic demand requirements with quite volatile supply from millions of distributed generation sources. Obviously, many of those are from using intermittent generation sources, as well as energy storage, as well as virtual storage, so in terms of thermal mass as a form of virtual storage. So the instantaneously balancing, the optimization with regard to utilization of the assets, and obviously it's there's many opportunities to optimize the way that assets are utilized, minimize the need for expensive augmentation that is shared with those who are participating in that optimization process. I think most importantly, really pivotal to this, is the incentivization of millions of consumer producers to participate in and receive a compelling quid pro quo, or a share of the value created through whole system optimization. And so with this body of work, the areas that we are working through are outlined here, and I'll just take you through those quickly. So looking at, as we think about all of those previous work packages, how might they actually converge and manifest with regard to the services and value that customers are looking for whom, what parties are actually participating in the creation and delivery of those services, how are they valued? And certainly another point here is how does that relate to consumer protections and so on around that value, and around making sure that all parties can participate in a way that is secure and has appropriate protections. The markets and institutions that will be required, how might they manifest? What kind of architectural processes need to be in place? What options are best for attracting and driving customer-oriented innovation? So John Bradley mentioned before about the notion of third parties, for example, co-creating new value solutions. We see that in many different areas of, for example, the Apple platform is a platform for the co-creation of value by third parties. The enabling infrastructure, Stuart Johnson's just been speaking to us around system architectures and how that relates to creating next generation platforms where the value of a distributed energy future can be monetized and transacted. What does that mean with regard to the technologies themselves that need to underpin and enable that? And obviously the monetization and transaction, the standards, mechanisms, and so on required for monetizing and dynamically transacting value, where the network functions in an increasing role of being a platform for exchange. Again, remembering that by 2050, we may have 30 to 50% of our generation volume, if you like, coming back upstream or at least feeding into the lowest end of the system. The regulation and standards. Again, what are the regulatory and particularly standards around those market designs and institutional forms? What are the transitionary processes? So how would we move? What things could we do in terms of incremental changes as opposed to step change interventions, which is obviously a critical thing. And this whole roadmap process is very much focused on an action-oriented view of the decade rather than a theoretical one. So how does it inform structured, interrelated action between all of the many moving parts? And then lastly here, system coordination. What would be the functional roles and responsibilities of networks and other market actors, given that we've spoken a bit about value networks as opposed to the traditional supply chain linear model? So what are the roles, the functions of the various actors? What capabilities are required to provide coordination of all of those various roles and functions? So clearly this body of work is, as I say, a capstone or a body of work that really brings together many of these other elements which are enabling elements of future electricity systems and bring them together within future market constructs and platform constructs. So the draft content of this work will be explored and matured at some sequential workshops in early July and in early August. We expect there'll be some additional webinars that may also be scheduled through August, September on an as-needs basis, typically with in the order of 2 weeks notice. Again, if you're particularly interested in this work package, please reach out to myself and my contact details are there for you. So at this point, I'm going to move straight over to Paul Graham, our Chief Economist, who's going to take you through the quantitative modelling that wraps around this entire program of work. So I'll hand to you, Paul.
Thanks, Mark. So as we've sort of said a few times throughout the process, in stage one, we focused the modelling on refreshing the future reform scenarios. In 2015, were the scenarios that were developed in sort of 2012, 2013 still relevant? And we made appropriate changes to make sure we'd updated all the information and assumptions of those scenarios so that they were up to date. But in 2016, our focus is a lot more on the roadmap, and what we need to be able to deliver in the modelling program is quantitative data that identifies and quantifies the net benefits of implementing the roadmap. And that could be net benefits from things like price reform, moving to a more transactive energy market, maybe volume growth through electric vehicles, all the things that the rest of the team are investigating in their individual work packages. We need to be able to figure out if we take certain steps, what net benefit does that have, and if we implement all of the steps, what is the net benefit of the whole roadmap? So that's our goal, and that's what we need to be able to do. within the modelling work. So, as I've just said, the difference here compared to modelling future grid form scenarios is, well, the future grid form scenarios, they were about what are the plausible alternative futures, but a roadmap is quite different in the sense that what we need to be able to say is, if we take what action, what outcome do we get towards getting a better outcome overall for the system and the customers. So it is quite a significant shift in the way we're doing the modelling compared to what we did in stage one. Two other important things to note are that will be all of the modelling is being done at a much lower spatial level. We were sort of doing everything at the sort of state and national level last year, but we're coming down to a sort of a zone substation level focus because we really need that to look at things like price reform, where you might have different locational and temporal pricing and the sort of transactive energy market concept in general, and also to get a better handle on microgrids and standalone power systems and where they might pop up across the network. And the second thing is really customer diversity. We really just talked about single representative customers last year, but this year we want to be able to acknowledge that there's a huge diversity of customers. So when we talk about customer outcomes there, we want to be talking about, you know, really, really diverse customer groups. So this diagram sort of shows you what the modelling framework will look like in terms of how we implement it. Where sort of both CSIRO and Energeia are working together to deliver this and delivering different parts of it, but also at the same time we're both trying to model the do this whole of system modelling and validate each other's work. So our general, you can sort of start wherever you want on this diagram, but if we sort of start from the top, we sort of are saying that there'll be a range of, in any given year, there'll be a range of tariff, in any given year, there'll be a range of tariff structures and prices available to customers. They'll make decisions about which sort of tariff and technology choices they want to make based on that input and other inputs, and they might also even make choices about moving standalone power systems or microgrids. Once we have that adoption information, that then informs our understanding of both on-grid and off-grid demand, and we sort of build up demand from the substation level up into the sort of network level and state loads. And then from that, we can work out what's the sort of distribution network expenditure and what's the expenditure at the generation and transmission level to meet those demands. And then, if you like, we sort of go back around the loop to understand what are the implications for that in terms of the system cost recovery and tariff options that might be developed in response to that. So that's, you can sort of say that in a minute, but it's quite challenging as a framework to deliver, and we're working very hard at the moment to put all that in place and start running the simulations that we need to run. The other thing we've been working on is getting all the data together, the inputs required to deliver the modelling. And sort of showing you on the next slide, we really developed a big portion of this data during the stage one refresh. So particularly the generation cost data, some of the policy settings we decided to use, and a lot of the technology costing and performance data. We did all that work in stage one, and that's quite a significant write-up of that in the technical report, which is available on the web. Some of that quite heavily drew on the storage report the CSIRO did, and we also drew heavily on the Australian Power Generation Technology report. But one of the things that we're really putting a lot of work into right now, as I said, around customer profiles, and this is really important because we, as I said, I think up until now we've really been thinking about customers a little too generally. Ultimately, what we want to understand is different types of representative customers, you know, within the residential groups and within commercial groups and so forth, because they have really quite diverse demographics and load shapes and so forth, and we need to match those together and then begin to build a picture about how different customers will be impacted by different actions in the roadmap. One of the ways we do that is to use this sort of clustering approach. So where we're able to have rich data sets where we've got lots of customers, we can then search for clusters, or if you like, typical profiles that represent, a group of customers. And then, so you might be able to characterise that customer and get a handle on them and know there's lots of customers that are similar to that customer in terms of the way they use energy and as well some of their demographics as well. So this work's going on right now, of course, and we're hoping to be able to bring you some results and share them with you at a workshop around July. And those results will be addressing, as I say, some of the roadmap actions that are coming out of the other work packages. Particularly, a lot of the pricing modelling should be ready by around about that time or a little bit later. And then we hope to refine that further with your feedback and try to bring some of the whole of roadmap net benefit modelling to you later on around August, September. We will have reports available as soon as we've gone through our internal review process, and we'll share those with you then. Thanks very much, and over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. So we do have a lot of questions to get through for this particular section. I'm just going to go up and hopefully find them all. So our first question comes from Rob. So question for the standard... Ooh, sorry, I'm just having some problems loading these. Question for the modeler in the team. Can you please provide some colour on how you have considered the relative rates of change of costs of competing solutions over time? And this question is directed for you, Paul.
Thanks. Yeah, so all of the time cost paths, if you like, for things like storage and solar, rooftop solar panels and large-scale generation costs, and also what we're thinking about in terms of the productivity improvements for networks. All of that stuff is in that technical report that we released last year. But if you can't find something, I'm happy for you to send me an email directly if there's something you're interested in particular, and we'll try and get that to you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Our next question comes from Stuart, and it's directed to John Bradley. Customers will become more involved, and technology allows this to happen quickly. How can we manage their sometimes lack of knowledge of what they are buying or asking for? E.g., in this industry, consequences can be more serious than issues which have arisen with things like Uber and Airbnb.
Yeah, and thanks very much for the question. Can I recognise also that there's another question that came up a little bit later? I might join these two together. That question was similar, which was from Rama asking, John, with respect to customer protection, are there any gaping holes in the retail law? And the short response to both of those questions is that this is an area we want to make sure that in any kind of roadmap that purports to be a comprehensive plan for how we manage the transition to this new energy environment, we're going to have to deal with how the framework, including the behaviour of businesses in the system, but also how the regulatory framework and the customer protection framework deliver to support those customers that do need support and those customers that are vulnerable. And vulnerability is itself a very charged question, and there's very diverse views on how vulnerability is felt in the community. But one of the things we certainly are identifying now in terms of the context, and some of this was highlighted in our interim program report, is that with the changes in the system, we're going to see quite different decisions being made by customers directly. You can see in those pie charts that Mark referred to earlier that we could see up to 25 to 40% of all system expenditure being decided by customers or their agents. And that means that while that investment is in the hands of customers and there's a great empowerment for customers in that decision making, it also means that customers or their agents are effectively taking on some of that due diligence and risk assessment that utilities have traditionally undertaken, where they've been responsible for large-scale capital-intensive decisions through a central grid. So there is a significant change in the customer's risk profile, if you like, potentially in some of those new products and services. We can see already that even though we're, as a country, still implementing the National Energy Consumer Framework, it's still a work in progress. We've still got differences between jurisdictions. And while it's not yet in place, we also see that there are gaps, if you like, in terms of new delivery models where you may not have the same regulatory protection for customers that are living within an embedded network. If they're going to increase with the use of microgrids, well, how do we ensure those customers are still looked after? We've also got frameworks like ombudsman's frameworks, which wouldn't necessarily, as of right, cover small customers in some cases that are supplied under new arrangements. So how do we ensure that there are those kind of access to ombudsman and redress frameworks? And then there's other issues around disconnection policies and financial risk, where a lot of the new services and products that customers take on might have effectively embedded within it a financial component or a financial product that that could be quite challenging for the customer to evaluate in terms of the outcomes for them. So the short version is that there is a lot to be considered there, and there's a really significant piece of work being undertaken, as I said earlier, by CALC under the Power Transforms project. And we're hoping that when that material comes out in the public domain later in the year, we can engage with CALC around that work and not only do our own work in this space through the roadmap, but also leverage the work that's already underway by players like CALC and Energy Consumers Australia on these issues.
Okay, thanks, John. Our next question comes from Rama, and this time it's directed towards Garth. Garth, what is your view on the scope financial intermediation in the sector? One would imagine this would be crucial to managing the risk allocation you've been highlighting.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a really good question, Rama. I guess in setting out some of the initial descriptions for how risk is allocated in the current framework in a stage one paper, our principal focus was around the sort of risks that customers and investors would consider as relevant, such as demand risk and price variation risk, risk of stranding, risk of changes in services, changes in services being provided to the standards sought by the community, reliability risks, those types of things. So that's been our frame to date. But obviously, as we've seen recently with some recent retail failure events, financial intermediation has follow-on consequences. So I agree this is something we should think about further in this work package, ensuring now that the financial intermediation and the future financial intermediation models don't undermine the overall risk compact in the framework. That's important, so we'll explore that. It obviously has some linkages too to the nature of future financial relationships between parties in the emerging energy market, so I'll also try to ensure your query is taken up in those other relevant work areas too. Thanks.
Thanks, Garth. Next question also comes from Rama, and it's also again to you, Garth. Do you consider the existing DM innovation allowances have failed to shift new tech from ideas to implementation? Are the learnings from these projects compiled and summarised anywhere? What about innovation in network operation itself? What are the factors that have gotten in the way? Is it a more cultural issue within the business, or non-aligned regular incentives, or some combination of both?
Thanks. Thanks again for all of those questions. I'm not sure we'll have time to kind of adequately address them all today. Well, I think where our focus for the stage two of the roadmap would probably be is looking at a higher level at the question. We know that many network regulatory frameworks, not just in Australia, have been criticised as not adequately creating the conditions for higher levels of innovations within networks. But we do have strong examples of demand management programs and projects from networks around Australia, so I'll try to identify a good resource for you to find these and get in contact with you offline around that and take that forward. Look, there's been a lot of debate about the factors that drive the speed of network innovation, and I wouldn't be doing justice to the issue by saying it's simply one or two factors and here's the answer. But what I would say is this issue of ensuring the right incentives and mechanisms exist to drive network innovation, that's front and centre of what's behind that third output in the regulatory package, the review of international practices. So if you look, for example, at the UK, they've been through multiple different models of incentivising and rewarding innovation, and we'll be aiming to review and summarise that and bring together other relevant international practice. So it's certainly something that we'll be delving into that third element. So thanks.
Okay, thank you again, Garth. The next question is once again from Rama, and this time it's directed towards John. What's your appraisal of what you're seeing from the recent DNSP pricing proposals, and also, or is it more interpretation and how these provisions have been implemented in practice?
Yeah, look, maybe the short answer on that one, Rama, is to refer you to our ENA website, where you can see our submissions on the DNSP pricing proposals. You'll be able to find our views around that. I think generally what we would recognise is that those tariff structure statements that are subject of AER consideration at the moment, there's generally been a kind of tailored approach from each of the DNSPs to develop their pricing proposals in consultation with customers. And depending on their local network circumstances and where they're at in terms of the context for tariff reform, there are different approaches and customer impact mitigation strategies proposed. That is one of the things we lay out in that tariff reform handbook, that there is a need for a kind of a sort of jurisdiction-specific proposal for tariff structure statements to be considered, and that it's tailored to local circumstances. So again, you might find our tariff reform handbook on the ENA website, which is currently out for consultation, a useful read as well. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, John. Our next question comes from Nick, and it's directed to Mark. How are TNSPs, AEMOs, AERs, AEMC, and I think it's jurisdictional bodies involved in WP4 and WP6 to 8?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So essentially, we're engaging very broadly across all of those parties and many others, obviously, to keep people abreast of what activities we're running through. Those parties would, in the case of some of the regulatory entities, they've expressed a wish to participate as observer status. Others actively involved as participants. But certainly we welcome their involvement. And I guess one of the differences between many of the other, if you like, change processes or other processes that are on foot is that this is really an effort to stretch our thinking out into the decadal sense, as I often refer to it. So think about it more in terms of, the 2027 view. What does that need to look like? How do we design or reverse engineer that journey? So it does actually, for all of the parties, whether the ones you've mentioned or others, it's an attempt really to not just be constrained by the immediate present of the issues we're dealing with, the rule changes we're pursuing or whatever, but actually to think of it from a future orientation and look at how that actually might change the way we think about the transition of the next 10 years.
Okay, thanks, Mark. The next question comes from Martin, and it's again directed to you, Mark. I don't recall hearing mention of energy retailers or the wholesale market throughout the webinar. Does the scope of work of the NTR include the role of those participants in the energy ecosystem, both in terms of cost sharing, value generation, and value sharing?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So I suppose it's true to say that as a network transformation roadmap, it does have a particular orientation around the transport end of the system traditionally. So that's probably the greater emphasis of the work. But particularly as we think about the next generation platforms and as we think about the future of pricing and incentives. Obviously, when you think about the system as a whole, then the other elements, the national market, retailers as well, and I have mentioned the term market actors a number of times, and that's a generic term that would absolutely include retailers as we know them, as well as in all of the ways that either retail businesses themselves will evolve and or other new entrants and so on. So we've also spoken about third-party actors or the co-creation of value. Again, that could be retailers per se or various evolutions of them or other new market actors. So really coming to conclusion on all that, you'll recall back at the with regard to the roadmap objective, certainly many of the efficiencies and optimizations that might actually occur from better orchestrating the way that distributed energy resources at the customer end of the system interoperate and function to create not only owner-investor value, but also societal value that's monetized, will have knock-on effects back up the system as well to all other parts of the chain, including the market, wholesale market. Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Due to pressing time, we do only have time for one more question. It's just a short one. It comes from Jess, and it's directed to John, but Mark, you might be able to answer it. Once the project is complete, how do you expect the roadmap to be translated into concrete change?
Sure, I'll let John run first.
Yeah, well, it would have been interesting to hear Mark's answer and see what he says, but he can have his go in a moment. Look, I think the reason why we've undertaken the roadmap, when we decided to initiate this piece of work and commence a partnership with CSIRO, part of the logic was that the Future Grid Forum work had painted a really clear picture around 4 potential plausible scenarios, but hadn't really identified what was most likely, or indeed what were the kind of specific actions that should happen over a 10-year plan to shape the better outcomes for customers, that some futures are better than others. And some of the things that need to be done in the roadmap will be things that will basically be things that need to be undertaken by our energy network sector itself. And so there's a lot of rich learning coming back from the work we're going to be undertaking, which will inform business activity, business strategy, the development of corporate capability within the sector to manage this transition. When you think about some of the things we've talked about today, there's a lot of change in terms of business systems and processes, workforce requirements that don't rely on external parties. But then there is also a significant that don't rely on external parties. But then there is also a significant component of the work that can really only be achieved. We can only achieve the roadmap if we firstly secure a social license and make sure that we've got the level of trust needed from our customers and stakeholders, but also if we achieve change in some of the policy and regulatory frameworks or things that require collaboration like standards. So it'll have quite specific areas of action and a quite specific perspective on the time frames for that. And we'd like to develop that as collaboratively as possible, working with other stakeholders in the supply chain. But we recognise that everyone will have their different view of the future, and probably everyone may have slightly different areas of priority in terms of what needs to change. But this would be our contribution towards trying to mobilise some changes we can all see as no regrets options. Mark, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. Look, the only thing that I'd say in addition to that, it would be, I think, as we think about the scale of transformation that we've been talking about today, and John has mentioned that there will be various perspectives on or preferences for the way the future may unfold. But I think what we've seen from the Future Grid Forum, as John mentioned, is really just the real value at a national level of having clearer views on the future, and now taking this body of work to then say, in light of those views of the future, as a nation, how might we make greater sense of the next 10 years en route to any of those futures and building resilience against any of those futures. We're not always going to agree on every jot and tittle of exactly what that journey looks like, but it would seem to me that the great value is going to be developing pathways that generally we've often been able to achieve fairly high level of agreement on the broad outlines of what the complexities are, what the major things we need to deal with, and some sense of their interrelationships, because that's a key part of it. Many of these things can't change unless other things change, and so getting a clearer sense as a society what those interrelationships are and how the whole system works makes a great contribution.
Okay, thank you both, John and Mark. In the presence of time, I would now like to proceed us to Section 3 of this presentation, Overview of the Diverse Range of Opportunities for Stakeholder Participation. Your first speaker in this section will be Mark Patterson.
Great, thanks again. And look, this last section, you'll be pleased to know, no doubt, that this is much shorter than the last one. We've covered a lot of territory that hopefully has been informative, and the slides will be available for your sort of perusal after this workshop. But given that, as I mentioned earlier, and as we've mentioned throughout, the really trying to build this body of work in a collaborative way is really central to the roadmap design. And I've walked you through the slide you have in front of you at the moment, just with the major elements that are operating in parallel throughout what is a very full year of work. And so with regard to that engagement process, I'll just run you through just the basic engagement principles that we've structured to really make the best use of the time and respect stakeholders' time as well. So I guess it's important to understand that the roadmap itself is intended to guide the transformation of Australia's electricity networks over this decade for a customer-oriented future. And so the program design is such that stakeholders should expect time-efficient workshops, webinars and feedback processes that do respect your time with adequate notice, reasonable feedback periods following workshops. So after workshops where you've had further time to engage around the topic in real time, there are typically feedback periods where further review commentary can be provided by participants, which may include out-of-session discussions. Sometimes we've found that a workshop needs to have a breakout subsequently to specific folks who have a key interest on a topic that perhaps hasn't been resolved in the course of a workshop, to try and work that through more fully. Typically, you would be receiving a summary of stakeholder feedback for work package you've been participating in, specifically how it's been acted on, where it may not have been acted on, and the rationale for why that is the case. It's important to realise that obviously we're trying to deal with this with a high level of engagement and collaboration, and yet both ENA and CSIRO also recognise that not all stakeholders will agree with all decisions made all of the time, I guess, and all the content developed. So in the cases where, through a transparent process, in the cases where there's points of difference that haven't been able to be fully resolved, the engagement principles outline the process of working those through respectfully, making transparent the differences of perspective, and actually making that and recording that very specifically such that further work subsequent to this roadmap project can be advanced, and so that the progress that has been made can be built on, or at very least key points of difference can be made very clear. And all of that, given the fact that obviously it is a finite period of development and one of many such processes, I would imagine, over the coming years as we navigate this journey as a nation. So really, just in terms of the engagement process itself, one of our last slides here is really just to give you the 40,000-foot view of the engagement process. You'll note in the bold that we have a certain rhythm of major workshops that occurs through this period from commencing with this webinar and through mid-July, mid-August, mid-September. So some major workshops, typically which would be in Sydney or Melbourne at a hotel site. And for those of you who've been involved in the Future Grid Forum or some of our Stage 1 activities in this program, you'll be familiar with that kind of format. And typically, what you would be receiving at those major events would be updates on the content development, updates on the relevant quantitative modelling as well, and given an opportunity to be engaging with that content, workshopping it through in a very open forum. And obviously you can see there that those major events work from review and feedback of the quantitative modelling and progressive outputs, the roadmap overview and strawman content review. So the advanced roadmap content review then as that third major workshop in mid-September. Obviously, throughout the course of our presentation today, you've seen that there are a number of content-specific or topic-specific workshops that occur, and these are the, if you like, the building blocks of the whole roadmap itself, such that it's evidence-based. And so you can see there that in mid-June, customer reorientation and the regulatory options workshops, so 2 half-day workshops on the same day, and then the other workshops that Stuart, John, Garth, and and Paul have spoken to you about. I won't belabor the details there, but we will again circulate that table to you. But in short, as you can see, there is a basic rhythm of workshops. You don't have to participate in all of them by any means. You can be quite selective about the things that are of most interest to you and your constituency. But we would absolutely welcome your active involvement in that process as a very open and we trust constructive one. Perhaps at that point, Jeff, I might hand back to you to see if there's any questions with regard to engagement or any final matters that people would like to raise.
Thanks, Mark. If you have any final questions, please type them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. We do have one question that currently needs answering. It's directed towards Mark. It comes from David. One problem with FGF was the lack of traction with the political process. Will there be politician-friendly documents to try and get more traction from this exercise?
Sure, thanks for that. So traction and politicians is always going to be a challenging topic, but certainly we'll be making every effort to communicate the content in simple, accessible ways. We have been requested to give briefings to relevant politicians and their advisors along the way on this body of work. So it's great to see that there's already a very high level of visibility among some of the most senior decision makers at a political level. So we'll be absolutely continuing to work to that end. I think, in summary, I would say that even despite some of the limitations with perhaps the forum, what we did see with that was that the impact on a number of decision-making processes was quite significant, and certainly the fact that it helped leaven thinking or, I guess, expand people's thinking about the future and give us a language to talk about the future, I think has been quite significant, even to the extent of quite a bit of global interest in the outcomes of that.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We'll just wait a few more moments to see if any further questions come through.
Just while we're doing that, maybe Jeff, I just might make one comment, John, that we're conscious of the fact that this has been quite a long webinar, and it's a useful format to really allow people to come and engage with us, and we really appreciate the number of people that are able to join. If we actually do things via webinars, sometimes it makes it easier for people than actually travelling or trying to participate through other forums. But we recognise that as part of that we've probably talked at you a fair bit, and it's been hard to have interaction. I think that's probably why we sort of want to make sure that we do have that scope that you see there for workshops and other webinars, which are probably more interactive as we go forward. But we think this kind of model today was a great way of reintroducing the detailed work program to everyone that's been a stakeholder in the process. Jeff, I'll hand back to you if there's other things we need to cover in terms of questions that have come in now.
Thanks, John. At this stage, we have no further questions. We do have a comment from Adrian saying thanks CSIRO and ENA team. Very helpful webinar, so that's good. It appears we have no further questions, so I'd like to just hand back to John Bradley for any closing remarks.
Yeah, and I think I may have just given them. We are certainly, as you can see from the amount of work that's to come, we're not being cavalier or kind of underestimating just how much we are trying to work through in this roadmap. But by the same point, it's really important that we actually do cover the breadth of the key strategic issues that are going to be so important to customers. And one of the things that will help us do that in a better way in a short period of time will be through your feedback and engagement in the process. So thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you via email on the contacts that we've provided and seeing you at some of our workshops where you're able to make it.